Welcome to the Digital Velocity Podcast, a podcast covering the intersection between strategy, digital marketing, and emerging trends impacting each of us. In each episode, we interview industry veterans to dive into the best, hard-hitting analysis of industry news and critical topics facing brand executives. Now, here are your hosts, Tim Curtis and Erik Martinez.
Hello, and welcome to this edition of the Digital Velocity Podcast. I'm your host, Tim Curtis from Cohere One.
And I'm Erik Martinez from Blue Tangerine.
And today on the show, we have an exciting topic of storytelling. As a business leader, you communicate and care, but probably bore because you lead with logic and reason when what your audience really wants is the emotional pull of a story. Park, our guest today, with his 3 proven narrative frameworks, shows you how to turn your data into drama, your tech into tales, and your facts and figures into fables that connect with the primal limbic brain, where we all have real decisions being made. He is here to help you excel through stories you tell, starting with the ABT, Agile Narrative Framework. Park, fascinating subject. Welcome to the show.
Tim and Erik, thanks for having me.
Yeah, that was kind of a mouthful of an introduction, though.
It was a story.
It was a story.
It was a story. How would you expect anything less? Park, back us up a little bit before we get kind of started here and give us a little bit of a brief synopsis of your story and kind of how you've arrived here today.
Yeah, absolutely. Man, my story started about 35 plus years ago in the advertising business when I first got into it as a writer and then account executive and a media buyer. I've done pretty much everything you can do other than design in an ad agency. And I opened my own firm called Park & Co. in 1995 and ran that for 20 years. But I got to tell you guys, in the early 2000s, I saw our work in branding and brand development really started losing its impact because we were really versed in traditional media, TV, radio, print, outdoor, that kind of thing. Our clients, our customers owned the influence of mass media. So they didn't have to rely on storytelling quite as much, although those that did had much more effect. Well, with the advent of social media, e-commerce, the interwebs, the masses became the media and they own the stories. And so I went and searched for how do you hack through the noise of the internet and still hook into the hearts of your customers where they buy with emotion. And that's when I found storytelling. I was lucky our middle child, our son Parker Howell, was going to film school at Chapman University in Orange, California. And while he was going there, I said, send me your books since I'm paying for them when you're done with them, because I want to know what does Hollywood teach you to be a competitive storyteller in the most competitive storytelling market in the world. That's when I found the hero's journey, Joseph Campbell. I applied it in our work in something I call the 10-step story cycle system for brand story narrative. It worked unbelievably well. It was kind of a science project of mine. I didn't know if it would work or not. That's when I really found my passion for teaching people. And now all I do is consult, teach, coach, and speak on the power of story internationally to business leaders. I no longer run my ad agency, got out of that business. And here I am today, lucky enough to be on your show.
Here you are today. That is for sure. We're lucky to have you. The topic of storytelling, you're right, it sort of went dormant for a while. It was no longer what the focus was on. The focus was on all the new bright, shiny objects related to digital. Digital at the time, until recently, was relatively like the Wild West, right? Mostly self-governance. There was not a lot of legislation that really dictated how people were to act and what constraints they had. So those were the areas of focus. What's ended up happening, in my opinion, is in looking at some of the neurological work and studies, you begin to see that the brain is adapting to digital in a way that is really preventing digital from having the kind of attention it had before. So we don't react to it the same way. But the one thing we still do react to is story. We're still hardwired for that story. And if we're looking to make something sticky, it just feels like we've got to really focus in on finding that narrative and really have something compelling to say so that that can be retained by those that we're talking to. It's all about the emotional appeal.
You're absolutely right that you have to have something compelling to say, but it's how you say it. So many people are non-narrative now, especially in the digital world. They are just pushing out nonsense. So think about this. This is one of the things that I think is so fascinating. We have this neocortex, right? This frontal lobe, executive functioning brain that is so brilliant. It not only put a man on the moon, we land stuff on Mars, but it created the technology and the internet that you could argue compounds at the rate and scale of Moore's law. That's how brilliant we are. And yet, everybody is still walking around with that subconscious limbic amygdala brain that has not changed appreciably since when our ancestors navigated and survived the savannah hundreds of thousands of years ago. It's essentially the same brain structure that we're using today to try to navigate and survive the onslaught of information. We just would rather bat away because most of it doesn't make any sense to us, to our subconscious brain, unless you put it in the context of a story, setup, problem, resolution. That's where people so miss the mark, is just getting their content, whether it's a tweet, whether you're on Instagram, you're running ads, whatever it is, playing off of that brain, that setup, problem, resolution dynamic. And that's really the secret to hacking through the noise and hooking into the hearts this day and age.
Park, would you give some context to the audience of what you mean by it's hard to know what's really good and what's really not good because we're processing it so fast and discarding it so quickly? So what is narrative and non-narrative?
All right. So non-narrative is exactly that. There is no story arc. It's a bunch of information being thrown at you. Think of it as a bulleted list on a brochure of features and functions with a little bit of benefit thrown in. And this, and our brain gets bored very quickly after about 2 ands. It says, I'm out of here. That's non-narrative. What I mean by narrative is, think of these 3 words: and, but, therefore. So the and is a statement of agreement. The ABT works off this 3 forces of story, which is complete narrative. And is a statement of agreement. It's like act 1, we're setting the scene, and here's what our protagonist wants in the world. The but is a statement of contradiction, but they don't have it because of this major problem. Therefore is a statement of consequence. Because they don't have this, this is the way their life is, and or when we help them get it, this is the way life is going to look for them. This is what they really are wanting out of life. That is narrative. And the reason why it's narrative is that but is a plot twist. That but signals the limbic brain to pay attention. Something's going on. There's a problem. How are we going to get out of this? And of course, you as the brand or product or service, you are there as our mentor guide to show them how to get out of it. And but therefore.
So can you, just for the listening audience to help visualize, give us an example of each one of those?
Here's my favorite one. So I was doing a lot of work with Home Depot and their internal sales and marketing team, taking them through this. And one of the guys on there, we were doing a virtual session, asked me, Park, what's the shortest ABT that you know? I said, oh, it's easy. It's this one. You communicate and care, but bore. Therefore, tell a story. Now, that's very, very short. It's not a story in and of itself, but it uses the 3 forces of story. Agreement, you communicate and care. Yes, you're right. That's exactly what I do. Contradiction, but bore. You're right, I do bore. Therefore, learn how to tell a story so that you can connect with that audience sitting across from you and really beckon them into your story. That's only one example of it. I can give you a quick example of like how you might hear it in a tweet. Have you guys heard of Christopher Lochhead? Do you know who he is?
I don't.
No, I don't either.
He's this legendary Silicon Valley marketer. For all of your listeners out there, if you want one of the best books on branding, or what Christopher Lochhead calls as category design, get his book, Play Bigger. It's one of my favorites that I've ever read. Anyways, I was on Christopher's show about 8 months ago. I taught him about the ABT, and he thought, oh, that's pretty cool. He tried it the next day, and he was so blown away by it that he sent me a screenshot of a tweet that he used the and, but, therefore. And so he sends me this, and he goes, and check this out. Christopher Lochhead is very active on social media. Within 6 hours, he had over 60,000 engagements with that one tweet. He goes, I've never seen anything like it. It's the very first time I've tried the ABT, and now he uses it in everything that he does. And the reason why it works is because it plays that limbic brain. Setup, everyone wants to design a new category and build $1 billion business. That's our statement of agreement, yes. But here's the problem. There's too much startup BS on Twitter. It's hard to know where to listen. who to listen to. Therefore, here's the next step you take. Our limbic, cause and effect, pattern seeking, decision making, buying brain loves that format to communication, which uses those three forces of story.
The ABT framework, and I like the word framework. I think the framework aspect of this is important because when you're talking about something like forming a narrative or articulating a point of view and you're putting it into a narrative format, the challenge is that oftentimes feels so overwhelming to someone who has not mastered that concept. We're not gathered around the bonfire anymore, and we're not sharing those kind of stories. So we're out of practice. You mentioned our limbic brain. Yeah, it's still the same brain. It's still the same neural networks. That's like asking someone to write about something that they just talked about, and they can't do it unless there's a framework provided. The framework is important. Is there a step after the ABT? What's sort of the next thing that you would, in terms of that framework from ABT?
Yeah. So what I do, in fact, I learned all this exactly opposite to how I now teach it. I started with the very complex hero's journey, boiled it down to the 10-step story cycle system. It's been very effective, but it's complicated for people to get, which then led me to the 5 primal elements of a short story. If someone is just sitting around and they're trying to make a business point and you use these elements, this is the best way to do it, because everyone will argue with your data and your opinion and your assertions, but they can't argue with a true story well told. Even those 5 steps, Tim, I found people were having some challenges with. That's when, a decade ago, when I found the and, but, therefore, from a brand marketing standpoint, I was like, this thing is as powerful as anything I found to communicate a complex message simply. So to answer your question, the next step is, once you get this ABT down and use it everywhere, practice it in your emails, practice it everywhere, you'll start building your narrative intuition. And then you move into those 5 primal elements of a short story, which is essentially just an expanded ABT. The difference is that is actually a true story that you're going to tell, a little fable, an anecdote, whatever, something that you can tell in under a minute that makes your business point for you. What I really like to coach people on is use the ABT and the 5 primal elements as a 1-2 punch when you are trying to own the room and get your audience leaning in immediately. You start with an ABT to set the stage, and then you say, for instance, then you tell a little anecdotal story that supports the problem solution dynamic that you've introduced in your ABT. And by the way, you can do both of those in under 90 seconds. And you've used 2 proven frameworks that hacks the noise and gets into that limbic brain, getting in your prospects to lean in.
The ABT, you go in depth in the narrative gym for business, right? That book?
Yep. It's a 75-page guide that they can use to guide them along.
Okay, perfect. I want to make sure, number one, I have the right book here.
Yep.
Both Eric and I work with a lot of different types of brands. And when we're articulating something to a brand, a lot of times they don't see it. They don't see that it's useful to their brand. That's the challenge.
Give me an example of you run into that problem.
One example is you take a brand like apparel. They just don't necessarily always see that they can formulate something out of something that is wearable, disposable, whatever. It's a bit more of a struggle. When you're selling something like a piece of technology or like an Apple Watch or something like that, there are some things that maybe seem more obvious to the process. But when you back that up and you're in some of these niche categories, it's hard. And it's almost like you're providing those writing prompts for them. Those are the areas where people struggle. How do you help people who are in an industry that otherwise would seem difficult to fabricate, or create a narrative?
So maybe an example might be something like you're selling a white button-down collared shirt amongst how many others that are selling white button-down cotton collared shirts. So that's kind of where Tim's going. Like, that seems to be the struggle, is how do I infuse a story on such a basic thing?
Boy, have you seen the Ralph Lauren documentary? He essentially invented storytelling for apparel, even in his photography and everything he did, versus just showing the apparel, show it within a scene that begs the brain to make up a story. Like, what's going on here? They've got them out on these crazy Chris Craft boats, or they're by horses or whatever. The first person in the apparel part of it, Tim, I would say, is just look at Ralph Lauren. They've made a gigantic industry out of storytelling in apparel. But when you've got something like a white button-down commoditized shirt, Your story is not about what you make. It's not about that shirt. It's about what does that shirt make happen? Or what is the mythology or the ethos around that shirt? Now, some stuff, maybe you just can't. You just got to go out and be the low price leader. Margins aren't going to be there. So you better sell a whole ton of them. If you want to step out of that primordial muck, you've got to wrap that white shirt or that commodity in meaning. It has to stand for something bigger than what it actually really is, if that makes sense. So I tell people, your story's not about what you make, but what you make happen in people's lives. Your customers actually don't care about your brand, really. They don't care about you. They don't even care about your product or service or your cool code or whatever that really great thing is that you believe is going to change the world. They only care about the outcome. What do you make happen in their life? And that is a story. It's never features, functions. It's a little bit of benefit. It's never numbers until you have really clearly articulated what is going to happen positively in their life if they buy in to what you have to share.
What you're selling.
Yeah.
I need to go watch the Ralph Lauren. You said it was a documentary?
Yeah, it's a documentary. It's on Netflix. We saw it a couple of years ago. It's fabulous. My wife's a huge Ralph Lauren fan. And then when we watched it, I became a huge fan because they talked about how they reinvented marketing around the apparel industry. And it was always about storytelling. He pushed it. We have to show them a story.
Someone else that was really at the forefront in the advertising in our world was David Ogilvy. Everything he touched, and it feels very intentional with him. And if you read any of his books, you'll kind of understand everything about David Ogilvy was intentional. He sometimes actually used visual elements along with the story to tell the story in both a narrative and visual format. So those are the kind of key inspiration points that I think is probably important that we point out here. So yeah, note to self.
You're telling me about Ralph Lauren. I was thinking, I couldn't think of the name of the company. It finally came up, Duluth Trading Company.
With the underwear commercials, the animated underwear commercials.
With the underwear commercials, they've done a really amazing job of making underwear an actually interesting topic.
Yeah, a very good example of it. B2C, you're going to find better storytelling than you find in the B2B world. And I think the reason why is the B2B world thinks, oh man, I'm just selling numbers and data, charts and graphs. That's all I got to worry about. I don't got to connect with that, woo-woo emotional stuff. But I'll ask you two, what is the first syllable in the word numbers?
Numb.
They mean freaking nothing to our brains. You think our ancestor, when they were out there a mile from their cave and they came across a saber-toothed tiger, that they thought, gee, I wonder what that cat weighs. I wonder how fast it is. If I triangulate my speed to the cave and its ability to run me down, do I have a chance? No. Our brains, they're not wired in their survival mechanism to make any sense out of numbers. It's always about the outcome. Place that number in the context of a story. So I think that's where business to business falls flat on its face. Most of them do a really horrible job of advertising and telling stories in it.
They do. Talk about a group that is oftentimes uninspired by not being able to see, how to use emotion and narrative in selling. But the reality is the very same people who make purchases in the B2B realm are the same people who make B2C purchases. They're still humans. They still have emotions.
You're right. Yeah.
And there's opportunities for emotional appeal to that audience. That's a fairly consistent reminder that has to be given to the B2B audience. It comes up every single time I'm on stage speaking. Every time that question comes out.
You're so right. They think people are buying with logic and reason, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. They're buying with emotion, and then they're justifying that purchase with logic and reason. So whenever someone's sitting there, and I get that same pushback, Tim, in B2B world, we just got to show them the numbers. The numbers sell themselves. That's total BS. You have a Homo sapien sitting across from you, which essentially is a storytelling monkey. That's the only thing, one of the big things, I guess, not the only, but one of the big things that separates us from every other living entity that we know of. Homo sapiens, we plan, we organize, and we act in story. Think about it. When we are trying to get someone to buy into something, we are first selling fiction. We're trying to get them to buy into what a brighter day tomorrow would look like if they just take this action now. So they have to buy that fiction. Then it is up to us as the storyteller to deliver on all those promises we make in those stories and make sure that if they buy into it, become an active participant in our story, that we are delivering. And that tomorrow is what we said it would be. And we turn that fiction into fact, whether it's B2B world or the B2C world. That's what you're doing, not getting people to buy, but getting people to buy in to what you stand for and the outcomes that you can have in their life.
So walk me through this. I'm going to set the stage here. So you've got a relatively new marketer who's taken the helm at one of these brands. And let's assume that they have your books and they are reading through your books. But you're going to come in for the day to help train them to get further down the road on the ABT concept. Walk me through what that day looks like.
So what I do is I first have them do my online course. And it's a 1-hour course, 3 20-minute modules from me where I take them by the hand and walk them through ABT 101, 201, and 301. In addition to that, they're reading the books. We sit down, and in my first part of my session, let's just say the first session's 90 minutes long. Typically, the first 20 minutes is I'll take a deeper dive on what they learned from that online course so that they can really start embedding it in their thinking. Then we will build 3 or 4 of their ABTs live with the group. They will have supplied them to me in advance. And these will be ABTs that they've written relative to work. It could be a landing page. It could be a sales presentation or whatever. We build those live with the group so they can see the before and after. And I get a chance to do live coaching so they can go, oh, okay, I get how this all comes together. Then we go to a 20-minute breakout session. And I like to break people up into 4-person teams. I give them 5 minutes to either flesh out more of their ABT or write a brand new one. And then the next 15 minutes, they share them within the team and they coach each other on how effective their ABT is or how they might switch them around. Come back on, we do another live round. This is the beautiful thing about them doing the pre-work because we get to workshop them. So it's very intense and it's very immersive. Once we get that ABT really launched in place where they're starting to build their narrative intuition, then, Tim, we go into showing them the 5 primal elements of a short story. And again, remember that 1-2 punch. Now that they got an ABT down, they've made their claim in under 15 seconds with that ABT of what the problem and the solution dynamic is. Now they've got to proof it out with an emotional story that demonstrates this problem solution in action in someone's life. So I teach them how to do that. And I show them brands that do a real exceptional job already at their storytelling. Airbnb is one of them. And I'll bring in those examples and say, look, you can see the 5 primal elements. The one point I like to make to your listeners here is when you start seeing this stuff, it's kind of like, oh, duh. Or, oh, I've already been doing that. I just don't do it all the time. What I'm sharing with you is nothing I invented. It literally has been around since the beginning of recorded storytelling. Gilgamesh is based on an ABT and the hero's journey. So I'm not making this stuff up. I'm just revealing it to the world. So what I like to tell people is to learn this stuff and evolve from being an intuitive storyteller, which we all are, as that Homo sapiens storytelling ape. We are intuitive. I want you to become intentional using these frameworks, and you'll have way more success in your communication that way.
You know, you make a really good point with that Epic of Gilgamesh reference. It really does go back and reinforce that we are built for story. 6000 BC, you look at the Egyptians, the ancient Israelis, you look at the Greeks, the Romans, and story upon story is the element or the foundation of their society to pass knowledge from one to the next. And the level of sophistication of those stories, of course, changed over the years. But the point is, we're simply wired for it. Absolutely.
You read Novel Harari's book called Sapiens?
No, but I am familiar with that one.
It's fabulous. It's fantastic. It's one I read twice now, and then I read his one that came after it. But he does a really nice job of talking about humanity in a very short time frame window of history. But storytelling is at the heart of everything. And a lot of what I've learned about this idea of being a storytelling ape came from what his research and some of the writings in that book. So I highly recommend it to your listeners. A fabulous book, Novel Harari's Sapiens.
This is fascinating to me. I was just thinking about examples of, you're sitting in a pitch discussion, or you're doing an RFP, or you're trying to find somebody to help you with a particular problem. I can tell you one of the more recent ones that I've sat through was buying email services. Just a simple, like, I'm going to buy a new platform to put all of our email marketing content on for a particular client. And as we're sitting there listening through the presentations and talking to the salespeople, you got me thinking about, well, why did we choose vendor A over vendor B? Not only is it the storytelling part of it, but I like the story. I bought into the story, and I like the person who's telling the story. So there's some other factors. We're wired to engage with people who tell us stories that we like.
You've heard that age-old axiom of people don't buy from businesses, they buy from people. So absolutely right. Can I trust this person? Yes. Do I like this person? Yes. Will they deliver for me? Yes. Will they help me look like a hero in my own company? You get to the point that you are now already bought into this individual, and you are now just trying to justify this purchase in your head. And I learned that from Robert McKee, who's a legendary screenwriting coach. He has this course in LA, in New York, and London called Story. And it's 3.5 days of Robert McKee for 8 to 10 hours owning this stage. I went to it with our filmmaker son back in 2009, and it was at the Sheraton LAX. And I was in this cold, dark conference room, or really ballroom, for almost 4 days listening to this guy with 300 other people. All of them, with the exception of about 5 of us, were all screenwriter wannabes. The other 5 of us happened to be in the advertising marketing world, just curious about, what does Hollywood know that we could use in our own life? Robert McKee on the second day stood up on stage and he said something so profound to the marketing world, but remember, he's not talking to the marketing world, he's talking to screenwriters. And he was trying to make the point about subtext. He says, you have to understand your audience in a godlike way, which means you have to understand the protagonist in your story in a godlike way. What makes them work? What motivates them, and so forth? Because when they show your film, that audience has to believe so much in that character that they see themselves into it. Then he goes on, and here's the line that blew me away. He says, make no mistake about it. Our conscious mind is simply the PR department for our subconscious mind, where all the real buying decisions are being made. And I sat there gobsmacked as a marketer, saying he may as well be talking to a room full of marketers, but he wasn't. He was talking to a room full of screenwriters to show them how to get your audience to buy into your character, buy into your story. Well, that's exactly, as marketers, what we're trying to get our audiences to do.
So let's bring this back into the world of retail and e-commerce. That's where most of our listeners live. They're selling stuff to consumers, to an audience. They're selling everything direct to consumer. They're selling underwear, and they're selling snack foods, and they're selling more exotic foods. We've got a client who sells all the supplies that you could ever need for your car dealership. We have a wide variety of these businesses. Some of those topics are more mundane than others. Let's just be frank, we perceive it to be more mundane than others, even though they may be very complicated and very interesting businesses. So where would you say for these brands, what's the starting point? What's the very first micro step I need to take in order to start changing that narrative so that I can appeal to that subconscious mind?
Perfect. Let me walk you through the 3 steps in order of priority. So the very first thing is identify your audience. I know that sounds like duh, but here's what happens. Whenever I say that, somebody goes, well, I'm selling to everybody. Everybody needs my underwear. Or I've got 5 different markets I'm selling to. And I say BS on that. It's the Pareto principle. 80% of your sales comes from 20% of your customers. And that's usually one persona, one individual. So I want you to write down who's that person and be as absolutely specific. So specific that it scares you. that you're like, man, I'm going to lose so much business because I'm just focusing on this one person. Well, actually, just the exact opposite happens. So I want you to say, who's that individual? What do they want in relation to what my offering is? And why is that important to them? That's your statement of agreement. Who am I selling to? What do they want? And why is that important to them? But statement of contradiction. But why don't they currently have it? Because of what? Make that contrast as big as you possibly can between what a brighter future looks like tomorrow, what they want, but they don't have it. And they feel like crap because of this. You got to build that contrast there. Then your audience will give you all day for your therefore statement. Therefore, picture what tomorrow's going to look like when you buy this or buy into that or whatever. If you answer those 5 questions in the 3 steps of the ABT, it will help any brand get much more focused on who their audience is and how to clarify that brand narrative. Name the audience, what do they want, and why is that important to them? But why don't they have it? Therefore, how are you uniquely equipped to help them get it? You want to do a quick little exercise?
Sure. Let's do it.
Let's do it for your podcast. You guys got your brand story down for your podcast? What is the digital velocity brand narrative?
In an ABT format?
We'll get there.
Okay.
Go for it, Tim. I'll let you start with that one.
You want me to start?
I'm passing the buck on this one.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Eric.
You're very welcome.
I have a lot of great ideas, but I'm going to let Tim go first. Therefore, Tim, the floor is yours.
There's a theme here. So how we set the podcast up is it's a podcast that covers the intersection between strategy, digital marketing, and emerging trends, and the impact that each of us has related to those. That's how we set it up. When we align content or we align guests, we're really looking to make sure that the guest is going to align to something that moves us down a pathway. You know, and storytelling, for example, narrative, it's an emerging trend again, because it was set aside and now you're seeing it being more pervasively talked about. So that's an example of how an emerging trend would impact us.
All right. So let's go in and say, now we want to get this thing boiled down to so someone can ask you, Tim, when you're on stage about your podcast, you can nail this in under 10 seconds. It's your 1-floor elevator pitch. And by the way, for your listeners and everybody here, when you're doing this, when you're working through these ABTs, they take a while to get down. But what they really do, it's a fabulous exercise for your brain to say, all right, and to get real with who am I actually helping in the world and why do they care? So who is your number one audience? Eric, I'm going to throw this one back to you.
Yep.
You appeal to a lot of folks, but who is your ideal number one audience?
If I really, really get down to the heart of it, it's somebody who is looking to build additional knowledge. None of us can be experts at everything. We need to look for alternative sources of knowledge to keep building our skills and our skill sets and have tools that we can apply in our everyday jobs to make whatever we're working on better.
I got to punch you in the nose on that one, Eric. Great start. Way too high level. Are you talking to chief marketing officers? Are you talking to sales enablement people? Are you talking to CEOs of companies doing 20 million in revenue? Who is your number one audience, as specific as possible?
CEOs and directors of direct-to-consumer retail.
Okay, now we're getting somewhere. CEOs of direct-to-consumer retail. Awesome. Okay, perfect. What do they want in relation to your show?
Is this Eric or is this?
I think it's me still. I think I'm still on the hot seat.
Well, I wanted to enjoy it for a little bit longer. So.
Oh, yeah. For those of you listening, Tim's sitting back with both hands behind his head and rocking.
Yeah, but you're sitting on a beach right now, Eric.
Yeah, that's, well, figuratively speaking. I think that they are looking for ideas. I know when I listen to podcasts, I'm looking for ideas. I'm looking for inspiration in how to do what I do better than I did the day before.
So Tim kind of said it earlier, maybe a little bit, that inspiration, whatever, but they want to expand their knowledge around digital trends. And if they've got this knowledge, then they should be able to expand their revenue, their sales, their community around their brand and so forth. Is that fair enough? I'm coming in very high level.
Yep. That's what they want, right? At the end of the day, that's what they want. They want to grow sales.
They want to really understand these trends that are happening so that they can grow sales. If they're at the bleeding edge of these trends that are happening, then they can grow 10x their sales or whatever in the direct consumer world. Okay. But what's the main problem that you help them overcome? I know you solve lots of problems for them, but from your show perspective, what's the main problem that you are helping them with?
The main problem is providing a resource for that knowledge. I'm saying it very, very poorly because I'm trying to overthink it now instead of keep it simple, right? I think honestly, it's overcoming the knowledge gap. There's lots of trends going on in this industry that we work in. There's lots of things going on and something's changing every single day. And it's really hard to keep up with it all. So where do you go? We're trying to solve part of that problem as being one of the places you can go to learn about some of these trends and take some actionable steps in order to take advantage of them or defend against them. Either one of those scenarios might be true, depending on your business.
And for a point of clarity, this knowledge gap, is it just about the digital marketing realm, or is it knowledge gap across the industry of direct to consumer retail?
It's across the industry of direct to consumer retail.
Okay, but your podcast is called Digital Velocity. So are you really primarily focused on the digital realm, or are you kind of covering everything?
We do spend a lot of time on digital topics, but it is a little bit broader than that. The reality is, whether your marketing is primarily digital, your function, or not, the trends that are affecting that business affect all sides of the house because we're working with executives. They're not only focused on this one thing. The reality is digital has such an expanded definition in today's society. A couple of years ago, the concept of digital in the pizza market. What does digital have to do with pizza? Well, Domino's absolutely dominating Pizza Hut because they did a better job of incorporating digital into their marketing. But pizza is not necessarily a digital product. So I think there's a lot of digital experiences that are above and beyond, but in reality impact brick and mortar retail, print, literature. There's a lot of things going on where all of these things are starting to blend together.
Yeah. And I think when you're talking about the focus, in order to excel in your digital role, you also need to have exposure to a higher level of thought related to management, to leadership. One of our most popular guests focused on innovation. So you may say, well, how does that align to digital? Well, those are the supporting structures that allow you to excel in digital. So while we'll talk about some very zeroed in subjects that are vocational in nature, we'll also surround that with content that positions the individual in a place to best execute that vision.
So it sounds like we could even dial in your audience a little bit more from CEOs of direct-to-consumer retail to digital professionals in the direct-to-consumer retail industry. Is that fair enough?
Yep.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is digital is growing so fast, trending so quickly that it is impacting your operations and sales both online and off.
Yes.
Yeah. But you're not taking advantage of this because the knowledge gap is so great. It's nearly impossible to keep up with everything else you have on your plate.
Yes.
Therefore, imagine how much easier your life will be when you listen to us 1 hour a week, where we will share with you people from around the world that can help you anticipate the changes in the digital environment out there so that you can not only exceed your goals, but become even a thought leader of your own in your own world in the digital retail space.
Yes.
Is it something like that?
Something like that.
Now that's long-winded. It's big. We call that an informational ABT because all I'm doing as a writer at this point is like, all right, man, I'm just trying to capture the elements of my story here. You see what happened, Erik, where you first started off? Anybody that wants to know something? No, that's not an audience. We got it down to CEOs of direct-to-consumer retail. Awesome. Now we're talking about a category of audience. And then Tim comes in and says, really, it's, about that digital professional. All right, awesome. Within that category is the digital professional in the direct-to-consumer retail space, which now makes your show title completely make sense. Digital Velocity. How are you going to increase the velocity of your success when you have these enormous knowledge gaps to overcome and you don't have enough hours in the day to try to figure it out? Spend 1 hour a week with us, and we will share with you all the trending happening in the digital world so that you can have the impact in the direct consumer retail space you hope to have.
And that is a live workshop, folks. Right there in front of you.
Yep, that is a live workshop.
I love it.
Thank you, Park. The check is in the mail.
Guys, the reason why I do this now is because I think people are like, no, man, it's too simple. It can't possibly work. And I'm like, dude, I've been doing this for 35 plus years. I'm that old. Yes. And I'm telling you, my whole thing was always about brand creation. And I never thought about it from a story narrative perspective until I started getting those books from Chapman University, until I heard Robert McKee talk about this, until I studied the hero's journey. And by the way, Donald Miller, I know you guys are all story brand guys. Interesting thing about him is I went to his very first session pre-story brand in Oregon, 2008, 2009, when I was just studying story, and I loved his books. After that, I wrote a big article about Donald Miller and this thing and how I was researching it to use, what my knowledge that could create my story cycle system and amplify it. And then a year later, they come out with Story Brand. I'm thinking, did they read my article? And they go, hey, this dude's on to something. But the difference with Story Brand is they're a nice marketing tool. The work that I do from the ABT through the 10-step story cycle system takes you really in depth as to who you are as a brand, what do you stand for, why do people actually care? Then you use these narrative frameworks to go out and share that story with the world.
That's fantastic. And I think one of the things that I've learned just reading through the book a little bit and talking to you today is these things require practice.
Oh, yeah.
You make that point in the book. You start at the high level and you kind of narrow in and you keep narrowing in until you get to that perfect ABT phrase or statement that represents everything that you can do. So it does require work. It does require time, and it does require practice. Like anything else we do in our lives, you have to practice these things in order to be able to utilize them to help you with your business, whatever that business may be.
You're right. I'll get meta on you. The ABT is short and sweet, but tricky. Therefore, practice, practice, practice. And one of the best places to practice it is in your email writing. You got to write the things anyways. Have it stacked on top of it. Instead of writing that big long email where you're trying to figure out what exactly you're trying to say, so you're just clunking the thing out, take a breath, burn a few calories, thinking about how can I make this an ABT? Here's what's going to happen. Your emails will become 2/3 of the length of what they normally are. There's an automatic built-in CTA in the therefore statement, and you're actually going to get people to respond to you because you're not making them work for anything. You are hand delivering your story, your message in the ABT to the limbic brain the way it wants to receive it. So it doesn't have to fight for it. But as you do that, you'll practice doing these ABTs, do them every single day, and you're going to build over the course of 4 to 6 weeks what we call this narrative intuition, where you're going to start thinking differently and communicating differently, inserting buts and therefores, understanding this cause and effect thing, and you're going to evolve out of being non-narrative and boring, to someone that can own the room in under 15 seconds.
That's pretty powerful. I'm going to use the word game changing. And the reason I say that is Tim alluded to one of our more popular podcast guests. Her name is Carla Johnson.
Oh, I know Carla. She's fabulous.
Carla is fantastic. She has some of the same premises in her research and her work that you're talking about in your work. One of the key ones that we were talking about earlier is that we have gotten out of practice of doing these things, or we've been discouraged from doing these things because we're not creative enough or we're not whatever. There's a lot of commonality in what you're saying, and that these things are native to us, where it's inherent in our beings. We just have to learn how to use those skills again. The best way to hone your skills is to practice.
Yeah.
Practice. So for those of you listening, the implications are whether you're the person doing the work or not, your teams should be practicing these methodologies. Just before we kind of move to wrap up here, I want to ask you one more question. It's something that came up in the book that I think is really, really common. And I know I'm totally guilty of doing this. Talk about how people trip themselves up by going into two narratives or more.
Yes. And we all do that too. When you first write your ABTs, you're going to find you're going to cover a lot of ground in that first one. And there's going to be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different narratives going on. And our brain is not wired for that. Again, think of our limbic brain as a survival mechanism. And it has one job, and that is survival of the being. That's why it's so powerful as a pattern seeking cause and effect brain. When it's out on the savannah, it sees something move over there. The pattern seeking comes in and says, oops, that pattern was disrupted. What is that? Is that a cheetah, or is that my buddy Thog over there messing with me? That brain has not changed today. And that's why you want to be able to use these frameworks so that you're playing exactly to that. You've got to practice it day in and day out, and just use it everywhere. And in fact, use it in fun places in your tweeting. You're already tweeting, start writing tweets with this and, but, therefore framework. And you're going to see how it will work for you and help you evolve from being intuitive, meaning you're just winging it out there, to intentional, so that you can win it every single time. I lost my train of thought there, Eric. I don't even think I remotely answered your question.
We were talking about two narratives, right?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So why that is important.
Park just had like 6 narratives going on.
I was just going on like where I lost my narrative right there. So the narrative is that pattern. We don't want to throw a bunch of patterns at the brain, because the brain's going to go, I'm out of here. I'm not going to pay attention to it. You have to have a singular narrative, meaning you were talking to a single individual about a single problem and how you can help them overcome that. Now, quite often in a presentation, you will have 2 or 3 or 4 different problem solution points you want to make, and that's fine. But I want you to think of that presentation like a Christmas tree. You're going to find an ABT that has that singular narrative that you can relate all these other problems to, and then you're going to ornament that tree with your other problems, but you want to keep coming back to that singular narrative. There's a fantastic article in Outside Magazine, of all places, written by New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof, and it was about Darfur, and he was back there covering it and was trying to figure out why these atrocities were happening and no one seemed to really care. And he started doing a bunch of digging into it, and the reason why is that they had way too many narratives going on, way too many people going on, and he finally realized that you have to focus on one child if you're going to save 10,000 of them. You can't talk about 10,000 kids and have people care, but you can talk about that one little girl, Cecilia, and what she is going through. And oh, by the way, there's 10,000 more of her just like that. People will react to that singular narrative, that singular character. It's the way our survival brain is set up. So when you are selling, you want to make sure that you have a singular narrative that you're building everything else off of.
It's totally relatable. I love it.
Great book out there, The One Thing. Have you ever read that? The basic premise of the book is, what's the one thing you could do this morning that makes everything else irrelevant or unnecessary? We just take that to a greater detail. What is that one thing you were talking about in this presentation?
No, that's awesome. So, Park, we have exhausted our time, and I got a feeling we could spend another hour on this topic and not even scratch the surface of all the things that you could do with this powerful framework. So if somebody wanted to reach out and learn from you, what's the best way to reach you?
Well, here's what I want to do. The best way is my website, businessofstory.com. But let's take it up one step further. I really would like them to do the online course. It's only an hour, 3 20-minute videos. It's $125, but with your show, I'm going to build a landing page so you can get 30% off of that. And I'm going to have you go to businessofstory.com/DV for digital velocity. businessofstory.com/DV. You'll have a link there. I'll give you a promo code on that. I'd give it to you for free, but you won't take it seriously if you take it for free. You have to be invested in this. And if you don't want to do it, that's fine too. That's the best place, because they're going to get me 20-minute videos taking them through it. And then if they have interest or questions after that, they can shoot over to my email, park@businessofstory.com, and go from there.
That's fantastic. Well, Park, thank you so much for your time today and teaching us this wonderful framework and making us think about digital velocity a little harder. Tim and I got some work to do. That was a fantastic experience. I'm really, really glad that you took some time out of your very busy schedule to come talk to us. Folks, that's all for this episode of Digital Velocity. Hope you enjoyed content. Make sure you get a copy of Park's book. He actually has several books out, but this one is The Narrative Gym.
Actually, the Narrative Gym for Business. There is a Narrative Gym out there, but that's for the science world.
Narrative Gym for Business. We'll make sure that's in the show notes.
Oh, and by the way, one other thing, Eric, two other things. I'm going to put you two to the test. I want you to write your ABT, and when you're done with it for your show, email it to me, and then I'll give you some coaching, some email coaching.
That would be awesome.
Number two, on that landing page at businessofstory.com/DV, your listeners can also download a free copy of the Narrative Gym. They'll get it in PDF form. Really highly recommend the all of $7 printed form of it, but they can get a free entire book from that.
Awesome. We appreciate that offer. We'll definitely get that out to the audience. Well, that's it for this episode of Digital Velocity. I'm Eric Martinez from Blue Tangerine.
And I'm Tim Curtis from Cohere One.
Thanks and have a great day.
Thank you for listening. To learn more about how Blue Tangerine and Cohere One can help you generate more sales for your business, visit bluetangerine.com and cohere1.com. If you have enjoyed our show today, please tell a friend, leave us a review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Visit the digitalvelocitypodcast.com website to send us your questions and topic suggestions. Be sure to join us again on the Digital Velocity Podcast.